Story 1. I still remember that evening like it happened yesterday. I was 14, and my younger brother Adam was only 9. The three of us, Dad, Adam, and I, had decided to go out deer hunting. It was late autumn, and the sun was just starting to dip behind the trees, casting long, twisted shadows across the ground. Everything was silent, except for the occasional crunch of leaves beneath our boots. Dad loved taking us out, showing us how to move quietly through the woods, teaching us to watch every step. There was something almost sacred about it, especially during that time of day, when everything seemed to pause just before dusk. It was both eerie and beautiful, the way the light started to fade and the woods began to shift from familiar to something different. As we were moving through a dense patch of trees, Adam suddenly grabbed my arm, his eyes wide. "Did you see that?" he whispered, glancing back over his shoulder. I looked around, but all I saw were trees and shadows. "You're just imagining things," I told him, trying to sound confident. "It's just the woods at night. It messes with you." Adam seemed to hesitate, then let go of my arm and nodded, though I could tell he wasn't convinced. We continued walking, and I tried to focus on the trail, on keeping my steps quiet. But something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it. Maybe it was the way the shadows seemed to stretch and bend, or the strange quiet that had settled over the woods. Then I noticed something even more unsettling. The crunch of leaves behind me, the sound of Adam's footsteps, had stopped. I turned, expecting to see him right behind us, but he was gone, just like that. The path behind us was empty. "Dad," I whispered, barely able to keep the panic out of my voice. He's gone." Dad spun around, his face pale in the fading light. For a second, neither of us moved, both of us scanning the trees, calling his name. There was no response, just the endless rustle of leaves in the breeze. We started retracing our steps, moving faster, our voices getting louder as we called for him. It felt like an eternity, each second stretching, the silence around us pressing in heavier and heavier. After what must have been at least half an hour, we stopped, gasping, our breaths visible in the cool evening air. That's when we saw him, walking out from between the trees. Adam just appeared, like he'd stepped out of a shadow, his clothes streaked with mud, his face blank, expressionless. I rushed over to him, grabbing his shoulders. "Where were you? What happened?" Adam stared at me, his eyes slightly unfocused. "What do you mean?" he said, sounding confused, almost annoyed, like he thought I was playing a trick on him. "I didn't go anywhere. I was with you the whole time." I glanced at Dad, expecting him to say something, to explain, but he just stared at Adam, his face pale and tense. "Look at yourself," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "You're covered in mud. Where did you go?" Adam looked down at his clothes, at the mud caked on his pants and smeared across his shirt. He seemed confused, reaching out to touch the dry dirt, almost like he didn't understand how it had gotten there. His hand came away smudged, and he stared at it for a long moment. I don't know," he mumbled. "I don't remember anything. I was just walking with you guys." Dad stepped forward, his voice sharp. "Adam, did you see anyone, or anything?" Adam shook his head slowly, almost like he was trying to clear a fog from his mind. "I don't remember. I thought I never left. I thought I was right behind you." The way he said it, with that flat, almost robotic tone, sent a chill through me. I could see the confusion in his eyes, but there was something else, something off, something I couldn't put into words. It was like looking at someone who was half awake, trapped somewhere between a dream and reality. We stood there staring at each other, the silence stretching, heavy and unnatural. Finally, Dad shook his head and muttered, "Let's just go home." As we made our way back through the woods, I kept glancing at Adam, half expecting him to disappear again, or to snap out of whatever strange state he was in. But he just walked silently beside me, his face blank, his eyes empty. He didn't say another word the entire way home. When we got back to the house, Mom took one look at him and asked what had happened. I was about to explain, but Adam beat me to it. "Nothing happened," he said, his voice cold, distant. "I was with them the whole time." I tried to argue, to tell her what had really happened, but he looked at me with this strange, almost threatening expression, his eyes dark and hard. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that the person standing in front of me wasn't my little brother. Not entirely. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of it all. I kept replaying the moment he'd walked out of the trees, the way he'd looked at us like we were strangers, the mud on his clothes, the blank look in his eyes. The next morning, I asked him about it again, hoping that maybe he'd remember something, anything, that would explain what had happened. But he just looked at me like I was crazy, like I was making it all up. "You're being weird," he said, brushing me off. "I was with you the whole time. You just forgot." There was something in his voice, something so unsettling that I dropped it and never brought it up again. But to this day, I still wonder what happened to him in those woods, where he went, and what brought him back to us, if it was even him at all. Story 2. It was a few years back when I decided to load all my camping gear onto my bike and set out on an ambitious solo journey, 7 months and over 5,000 miles across the western U.S. I was alone, but I'd come to love the solitude, the rhythm of the road, the freedom of picking any patch of forest to be my camp for the night. Wild camping suited me. It was as though I could disappear into nature, slipping out of the world's view into the forest's hushed shadows. One evening, well into my trip, I found myself deep in the remote woods of western Montana. It had been a long day of cycling on endless roads that cut through sprawling, empty landscapes. By dusk, I was exhausted and found a spot that looked secluded enough to pitch my tent. I went through my usual routine, set up camp, ate a quick meal, jotted down the day's notes in my journal, and then studied my map for the next day's ride. As darkness fell, I noticed something was different. In every other camp before, there had always been sound, a chorus of crickets, the hoot of an owl, or even just the rustling of leaves in the breeze. But tonight, nothing. The silence was eerie, thick like a heavy blanket covering everything around me. It was a silence so complete, it pressed in on my eardrums, almost painful in its intensity. The absence of sound was louder than any noise I'd ever heard. I lay in my tent, eyes open, straining to hear something, anything that would break that unnatural quiet. My thoughts began to spiral. What could silence a forest so thoroughly? Coyotes? Bears? I knew that animals like wolves and bears tended to stay away from people, especially if they detected human scent. But this silence felt intentional, like something in the forest wanted it this way. I tried to reassure myself that it was all in my head. I closed my eyes and forced myself to relax, to rest after the day's ride. But then I heard it, a twig snapping somewhere off to the left. My eyes flew open and my body went rigid. In the deafening silence, the sound was startling, like a gunshot. I held my breath, trying to listen closer, but all I could hear was my own heartbeat thudding in my ears. A few minutes passed, and I convinced myself it was probably an animal. It's the woods, after all. Animals walk around. I shut my eyes again, determined to ignore it. Just a trick of my mind, I told myself. Nothing more. But then there was another snap, closer this time. I bolted upright, trying to see through the thin fabric of my tent. Of course, there was nothing. My flashlight was just out of reach, but I didn't want to move, didn't want to make a sound. I felt paralyzed, as if any movement might trigger whatever was out there. For what felt like hours, I sat there straining to hear anything else. And then it started, a slow, rhythmic dragging sound coming from behind my tent, scraping against the forest floor. I clamped a hand over my mouth to keep from making any noise. Every nerve in my body was on edge, each muscle coiled tight, ready to spring. But there was nowhere to go. If I tried to run, I'd make noise. I had no idea what was out there, and I didn't want to risk drawing its attention. The scraping sound paused, then started up again, even closer. My mind raced, filling with every possible nightmare scenario. An animal? Maybe. But animals didn't move like this. They didn't stalk so methodically, so slowly, with the kind of deliberate steps I was hearing. It sounded like something, or someone, dragging their foot through the leaves. I don't know how long I sat there frozen, listening to that sound creep closer and closer. Every instinct I had screamed at me to bolt, to get out of there, but I was trapped, bound by an overpowering fear. Then just as suddenly as it had begun, the dragging stopped. Silence fell over the forest once more, thick and oppressive, yet somehow colder than before. I sat motionless, straining to hear anything, and then a soft, barely there whisper drifted through the silence, just outside my tent. It said my name. A wave of ice-cold dread washed over me. No one else knew I was out here. I'd made sure of that. I'd picked this spot for its remoteness. How could anyone possibly know where I was? I sat there shivering, not daring to move, waiting for, I don't know what. But then the forest finally came alive again. A single cricket chirped, tentative at first, then joined by another and another, until the whole forest was buzzing with life. I'd never felt more relieved. Eventually, exhausted beyond measure, I drifted into a fitful sleep, haunted by the memory of that voice. At first light, I packed up my things as quickly as I could, barely daring to look around for fear of what I might see. I was back on my bike and down the road in record time, grateful for the sound of gravel crunching under my tires, the sun rising steadily in the sky. That sense of relief stayed with me for miles, even days, as I left the Montana wilderness behind. Story 3. I grew up on the edge of the Hopi Navajo Reservation, out in the endless desert, where the sky stretches on forever, but where everything feels close too. Out there, the nights are so quiet it's like the world is holding its breath, and every sound carries for miles. I was maybe 12 or 13 when this happened, early one morning when my mom and I were feeding the horses before school. The sun wasn't even thinking of rising yet, just that dark, bottomless quiet surrounding us. The barn we kept the horses in wasn't much, just an old shack with peeling paint and holes here and there. You could hear the wind cut right through it on bad nights. That morning, the air was still. It was the kind of dark that makes it hard to see anything unless it's right in front of your face. Mom had this old lantern she'd hang up to light the space, but it barely did anything to push back the dark. Anyway, we were just tossing hay, letting the horses eat. That's when I noticed they were acting strange. I mean, horses are skittish at the best of times, but this was something else. They were pacing, sweating in the cold, snorting, their ears pinned back. I remember looking at one of them, old Dusty, a gray mare who never spooked at anything. But she was different that morning. Wide-eyed, rolling, her whole body tense like she'd bolt any second. I asked my mom, "What's wrong with them?" And she shushed me. She was looking around, her brow furrowed. I'd never seen her look quite like that. She was listening for something, holding her breath like we were waiting for some predator to come out of the dark. And then I heard it, a low hum, not like anything I'd heard before, this deep, quiet vibration, almost like the ground was humming. It made my teeth feel like they were buzzing in my jaw. We stepped out of the barn, trying to see where it was coming from. Mom kept me close, practically pinching my arm as we scanned the horizon, searching for any hint of movement. But there was nothing, just that hum, getting louder but still strangely distant, like it was everywhere and nowhere all at once. Then something pulled my eyes upward, right above us. I squinted, not sure at first what I was seeing, but when I made it out, my breath caught in my throat. Hovering in the sky, almost directly over us, was this massive black triangle. I couldn't tell how big it was exactly, but it was close. Close enough that I felt like I could almost reach out and touch it if I dared. The whole thing was perfectly silent and so dark. It was smooth, no lights, no markings, just this impossible shadow that blocked out the stars behind it. My mom let out this sharp breath, like she'd been holding it too long. "Don't move," she whispered. I didn't even breathe, didn't dare look away from that thing. I remember thinking how cold it felt, even colder than the dawn air, like the thing was swallowing up all the warmth around it. It hovered there, just above us, and I felt like it was watching. I don't know how else to explain it. I didn't feel like it was a machine, or if it was, that it was something way beyond anything I could understand. Then suddenly, my mom's hand tightened around my arm, yanking me back toward the barn. "Inside!" Now! Her voice was a shaky whisper, like she was terrified to be heard. I didn't argue. She pushed me back into the barn, the horses stamping and snorting as we backed against the wall. She held me close, one arm around my shoulders, the other clamped over my mouth like she thought I'd scream. We just stood there, pressed against the wood, listening. The hum was louder now, vibrating through the walls like the whole world was about to shake apart. The horses were freaking out, stomping and kicking, eyes rolling with whites showing. I don't know how long we stood there, waiting. Could have been a few minutes or a lifetime. Eventually the hum started to fade, slowly, like it was pulling itself away. The horses quieted a little, their breathing still heavy, like they'd just run a mile. My mom loosened her hold on me, finally letting me go. She was pale, her eyes still glued to the barn door. She waited a long time before she even dared to peek outside. When she finally stepped out, I followed close behind, almost tripping over her heels. I was afraid to look up, but I couldn't help it. The sky was empty, just stars and the dim glow of the morning creeping over the horizon. Whatever it was gone. We stood there, just staring at the sky. Neither of us said a word. My mom, usually the rock, the one who always knew what to do, just looked stunned, like someone had stolen all the air out of her lungs. When we finally walked back to the house, I remember feeling strange, like I was moving through a dream, my body heavy and tired. My head started pounding, and by the time we got inside, I felt like I'd come down with the worst flu of my life. My mom was the same, her face flushed, sweat trickling down her forehead, even though it was still cold out. We just crawled into bed and slept, both of us knocked out for hours, though I don't remember actually falling asleep. I stayed home from school that day, and we never spoke about it again. I didn't tell my dad, and neither did she. It was like we both just agreed that whatever had happened, we were better off not trying to understand it. But even now, years later, I can still remember that feeling, the hum in my bones, the way the horses knew something was wrong before we did, and the black triangle silently hovering, watching us from above. I told myself for years that it had to be some kind of military aircraft. We had those secret bases out in the desert, and everyone knew the government tested strange things out here. But deep down, I never believed that explanation. Whatever it was, it didn't feel like something from this world. When I think about that morning, my skin still prickles. It was a glimpse into something vast and terrifying, something we weren't meant to see, hanging just beyond our understanding. Story 4. It was one of those suffocatingly still afternoons in the woods, where the only sound was my own breathing and the occasional snap of dry pine needles underfoot. The forest had a strange weight to it, like the air itself was holding its breath. I had been walking for hours, moving deeper into the backcountry where the trails became narrow, nothing more than faint paths carved by animals that had long since moved on. The canopy overhead was thick, casting deep shadows over everything, even though it was barely past noon. I was well prepared, or so I thought. I'd spent years out in the wild, learning its rules, adapting to its silence, its mystery, its dangers. The forest and I had an understanding, or so I believed. I knew not to push my luck, to respect the things that lurked just beyond my sight. But that day, it was like the woods decided it was time to remind me of my place. I came to a small clearing. There was something off about it, an eerie stillness. Normally, even in the quietest part of the forest, there are sounds, the rustling of leaves, the distant call of a bird, the chatter of squirrels. Here, there was nothing. The silence was so thick, I could feel it pressing down on me. Every instinct screamed for me to turn back, but I brushed it off, chalking it up to nerves. Then I saw the tracks. They were faint, barely visible, but unmistakable. Massive clawed imprints sank into the soft earth. Bare, I thought, and big, judging by the depth of the impressions. I crouched down to examine them, feeling the hairs on my arms prickling with that primal sense of alertness. And then, suddenly, I felt it. A presence. I can't explain it any other way. It was as if the forest was holding its breath around me, and I could feel something watching, waiting. I stood up slowly, scanning the trees, looking for any sign of movement, any shadow that didn't belong. I couldn't see anything, but I knew deep in my bones that I wasn't alone. I started walking, careful and deliberate, each step calculated, my eyes darting around, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever was out there. The silence seemed to deepen, swallowing up the crunch of my footsteps, leaving only the pounding of my heart in my ears. And then, out of nowhere, I heard it. A low growl so deep it vibrated in my chest, coming from somewhere just beyond the line of trees. I froze, my blood turning to ice. The sound was guttural, predatory, not quite like any bear I'd ever heard. I strained my eyes, trying to peer through the shadows, but whatever it was stayed hidden, just beyond the edges of my vision. I took a step back, every instinct in my body screaming at me to run, but I knew better than to turn my back on a predator. I kept my eyes fixed on the spot where the sound had come from, backing away slowly. My mind was racing, trying to piece together what I was dealing with. Bear? Mountain lion? Something else? Something worse? Just then, I caught a flicker of movement in my peripheral vision. A massive, hulking shape, blending almost seamlessly into the shadows. It was larger than any bear I'd ever seen, its shoulders hunched, its head low to the ground. But what made my blood run cold was its eyes. They glinted in the dim light, two pinpricks of cold, calculating intelligence, locked onto me with a gaze that sent a shiver down my spine. It took a step forward, and I could feel the ground tremble beneath my feet. My throat went dry, my fingers numb. I knew without a doubt that whatever this thing was, it was no ordinary animal. There was something almost deliberate about the way it moved, as if it was toying with me, savoring the fear it was instilling. "Easy," I whispered, more to myself than to whatever it was. "Easy." I took another step back, my foot catching on a root, nearly throwing me off balance. The thing let out another low growl, and this time, it sounded almost like a laugh, as if it was amused by my clumsy attempt to escape. It took another step forward, and I could see the outline of its massive paws, each one larger than my head, with claws that looked like they could shred through bone. I didn't dare look away, but I could feel my options narrowing. My mind raced through every survival technique I'd learned, every scrap of knowledge I had about wildlife behavior, but none of it applied here. This creature was something else, something that didn't play by the rules. It took another step closer, and I could smell it, a rank, musky odor that made my stomach churn. I tightened my grip on the small hunting knife strapped to my belt, though I knew it wouldn't do much good against something of this size, but it was better than nothing. I raised it, hoping that the glint of metal might at least make it think twice. It paused, tilting its head as if considering me, studying me. For a heartbeat, I thought it might actually back off, and then it lunged. I barely had time to react. I threw myself to the side, feeling the rush of air as it barreled past, its claws grazing my shoulder. I hit the ground hard, rolling to my feet just in time to see it skid to a stop, its eyes flashing with something that looked disturbingly like anger. This was no wild animal defending its territory. This was something else, something with intent. It crouched low, ready to charge again, and I knew I was out of time. My only chance was to make a break for it, to get to the denser part of the forest where it might have a harder time following. I took a deep breath, bracing myself, and then I ran. I didn't look back. I could hear it crashing through the underbrush behind me, its massive form tearing through branches and leaves like they were nothing. I pushed myself harder, my lungs burning, my legs screaming with each step. The trees closed in around me, the shadows growing deeper, and still I ran, the sound of its pursuit echoing in my ears. Just when I thought my legs would give out, the growling stopped. The silence returned, thick and suffocating, but I didn't dare slow down. I kept going until my lungs felt like they would burst, until I was sure that whatever it was had finally given up the chase. Only then did I stop, collapsing against a tree, gasping for air. I scanned the forest around me, half expecting to see those eyes watching from the shadows. But there was nothing, just the empty silence stretching out in every direction. I don't know how long I sat there listening, waiting. Eventually, I forced myself to my feet and made my way back, keeping one hand on my knife, my eyes scanning every shadow. To this day, I don't know what I saw out there, but I've never returned to that part of the woods. I don't think I ever will. Story 5. I was at the Belanglo State Forest, deep in the heart of New South Wales. The place was infamous, had a reputation that made your skin crawl if you knew anything about its history. It was the site of the backpacker murders, where 7 young souls had vanished, only to have their remains discovered scattered across the woods in the early 90s. I didn't know much about that at the time, at least not enough to really let it get to me. I was there for a big scout event, something like 1,000 of us gathered in a clearing, tents everywhere, and people buzzing with the usual noise of a weekend away. It wasn't much different from any other camping trip. A bunch of kids all excited for the weekend, and a few leaders making sure everything ran smoothly. But I won't lie to you, there was something off about that forest. I don't know if it was the way the trees stood so densely, or how the air always felt thick, but there was a lingering unease in the air. I remember it was around 9 p.m. when I felt that gnawing sensation that I needed to pee. The toilets were on the other side of the camp, and there was a line, a long one. I didn't feel like waiting, so I decided to just walk into the trees a little. There were enough of us milling about that I figured it wasn't a big deal. I knew the forest well enough, and I wasn't that far from camp. I went about 30 meters into the trees, the crunch of leaves beneath my boots muffling my steps. The further I went, the quieter it got. The rustling of the leaves seemed to fade, replaced by this oppressive silence that settled over everything. The only sound was my own breathing and the occasional snap of twigs. You'd think a forest would be full of life at night, but it wasn't. It felt like something was holding its breath. I pushed that thought away. This was just me being paranoid. Then I found a small clearing, barely a patch of grass, really. I stopped and unzipped. I didn't want to think too much about where I was, but the hairs on the back of my neck were standing up. The trees pressed close around me, their branches twisting like fingers, reaching for something just out of reach. I remember looking around, just trying to shake the feeling that something was wrong. It only took a second. I looked down at my feet. That's when I saw it. Bones, scattered all over the ground. They were small, too small to be from an animal. They were so white they looked almost too clean, like they'd been sitting in the ground for years. My heart skipped a beat, and I felt the blood drain from my face. I froze. I didn't even breathe for a few seconds. I couldn't move, couldn't think. At first I thought they were human. My mind raced as I tried to process it. How could something like this be here, in the middle of the camp? I hadn't heard anything about bones being found, nothing like that. And that was when it hit me, the sheer terror of the moment. I didn't know if I should run, or if I should stay and try to figure it out. But then, a thought surfaced in my mind. No, it couldn't be. They didn't look quite right. They were too small to be human, weren't they? I looked closer. I could feel my pulse in my throat, the panic creeping up, but still my eyes wouldn't leave the bones. I had to know, I told myself. But when I looked closer, that's when the horror hit. I realized they weren't human bones. They were animal bones. Too small for any person, too delicate for a human. But in the back of my mind, something told me they weren't just from any animal. I didn't dare to touch them. I didn't want to. But the more I stared at the scattered remains, the more uneasy I became. My feet started to move, slowly at first, away from the clearing, and I forced myself to calm down. I could hear my heart hammering in my chest. The silence in the trees was deafening, oppressive. There was something wrong with this place. Something wrong about the way the bones were laid out. And then I heard it. A sound. At first it was so faint that I almost thought it was in my head. But then it came again. A crunching, like something stepping on dry leaves. Not the usual sounds of the forest at night, but something deliberate. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. I couldn't tell where it was coming from. It felt like the air was thickening, like the trees themselves were closing in. I didn't dare look back, but the hair on my neck was standing on end. I couldn't make sense of it. It was the worst kind of fear, the one that gnaws at you even when you can't see the threat. I tried to swallow, but my mouth was dry. My legs felt like they were made of lead, and I knew if I turned around, if I looked back, it would only make it worse. But I had to move. I had to get out of there. I turned on my heel, still not looking back. Every step felt like an eternity, each one sinking me deeper into the forest, away from whatever had made that sound. I could feel the crunching of the leaves underfoot, the thumping of my heart, but I didn't hear anything behind me. Not a single sound. The walk back felt like hours, even though I knew it couldn't have been more than a few minutes. As I neared the camp, I saw the lights in the distance, safe, familiar. I pushed myself forward, my feet moving faster. I could hear voices now, the laughter and chatter of other scouts, and it made me feel better, a little less alone. But even as I passed the first tents and saw my friends sitting around campfires, there was a part of me that couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me, waiting, the bones, the sounds. There was something in those woods I couldn't explain, and even now I'm not sure what it was. All I know is that I never went back into those trees after that night, not even for a second.